we need to continue to have this conversation, especially in light of the demonization of our brother George Floyd for having opioids in his system. So I thought it would be, and I didn't know we were going to be in the midst of this Derek Chauvin trial when we invited you back, but look at God. So here we are. Talk a little bit about your assessment of this trial and the bringing in of the drug use of George Floyd as a defense for what Derek Chauvin did.
Well, I don't know if you know, but I wrote an op-ed back in June or July in the New York Times on this very issue. And the title was like, we know what killed George Floyd, and it wasn't drugs. I did that because my book details how police and the state use drugs or scapegoat drugs whenever a Black person is killed or whenever someone who is of low status is killed. They go to this sort of drug crazed Negro defense. It was the drug that did it, not the 9 minutes of this guy's knee on George Floyd's neck. And so what I did was I went and got the toxicology of George Floyd to see exactly what was in his blood. And he had THC, which is the chemical for marijuana. He had fentanyl, he had methamphetamine in his blood. But what's in the blood does not tell you about the person's behavior. And the levels of drugs that were in his blood, you can't tell because you know nothing about the person's level of tolerance. So like one dose that will kill someone will be a dose that makes someone else happy. And so the most important thing for us to look at is George Floyd's behavior.
Before we don't even know that he was still feeling the effects of these drugs that were in his system, right?
Well, this is why it's important. This is why I know that the ancestors are involved. Today's trial spoke to this because they talked to the clerk who took the $20 bill, and they asked he was affable, he was friendly. You know, the kid said he's 19. He seemed to be high, which I was like, I didn't like that, but high from a happy, not a high aggressive high or what, I don't know, but he said, he was balanced. He wasn't off balanced. It wasn't like he was crazed or anything. Speak to that. I'm sorry.
Well, Karen, it's like when we think about the blood, like I had some rum last night, for example. So I will have alcohol in my system today. Now, someone will say, well, he looks like he's high. They can say whatever they want to say. As long as I'm behaving appropriately, and I'm certainly not out of breath like you would be if someone chokes you. The important point that I tried to get people to look at in the New York Times piece is that how George Floyd was behaving. When he was attacked by the police, he was saying, please, I can't breathe. That's someone behaving like you would expect a normal person to behave. He got out of the car when they asked him to get out of the car. And the most important thing is he was breathing before the guy put his knee on his neck. And so I knew this was coming. That's why I wrote the piece back in June. I did this when we think about Philando Castile, another guy who was killed in Minneapolis, Laquan McDonald's, the kid who was killed in Chicago where they shot him 16 times. Same thing. They go to the toxicology. There was a brother in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Terrence Crutcher. He got shot by this cop, Betty Jo Shelby. She got off. He's dead, but they found PCP in the system, even though we saw it all on the video. He was acting normal. He was not acting aggressive or any of that. But they always go to the toxicology.
Eric Garner was choked to death by Pantaleo because he was selling loose cigarettes, right? In your case, it's the toxicology, but in general, there is an immediate rush to find something other than the precise proximate cause of what killed these guys.
Exactly. So the piece I wrote in the New York Times was like, don't be fooled by the toxicology because it's coming. And sure enough, it came. I even talked to the prosecutors in Minneapolis over the summer before this trial happened, because hopefully to help them understand how these things work. So we'll see how it plays out. But the bottom line is, people, believe your eyes. Don't believe the lies.
We're talking with Dr. Carl Hart. Of course, Don Calloway is here as well. The number is 866-801-8255. If you have any comments or questions, please call. Terrence Crutcher's twin sister, Dr. Crutcher, is a family member here on the Karen Hunter Show, and we've talked quite frequently. The notion that Black people are high, and you talked about a little bit last time you were here. Black people turn into these superhuman. Like, this is the myth, and this is where I'm like, I really feel like we need to double down on the tropes and the narratives around how Black people are perceived, and how even D.W. Griffith, how we have been demonized in a way, or mythologized. Talk to that. Talk to, even you talked last time, I think Coca-Cola used to have cocaine in it. Yes. And once they bottled it, they were like, oh, Black people have access to this drug, so let's demonize Black people, become bulletproof when they get this Coca-Cola in their system. This is part of the narrative that George Floyd was uncontainable because he had this toxicology.
Absolutely. So if we just go back through our history, the first drug laws that were passed in this country, the first national laws, were passed in 1914. They tried to get that same law passed in 1909. It wasn't happening because Congress was in no mood to have the federal government tell the states what to do. So in order to get the law passed, what they did was they concocted these stories about Black men who were taking cocaine, and then they developed superhuman strength where they were unaffected by 32 caliber bullets. And so throughout the South, even the New York Times was reporting this sort of thing. Southern police groups changed to a higher caliber weapons to deal with this mythical Black cocainized person. And it worked because in 1914, when the hearings were had at Congress, this was said repeatedly, and this law passed, and it became the first national drug laws that restricted drugs in this country. So the important point here is that drugs are not banned because of pharmacology. Drugs are banned because of racism, the same racism that we see today. So that's one of the major points of the book, to try to help people understand how we've been played and how we continue to be played. Our community is being played, and drugs function as this sort of tool so people can come through and just take advantage of the community in any way they want to, as long as we say drugs were involved.
I just want to point out something that I think you kind of brushed past, or we moved past quickly, which is you spoke with the prosecutors in Minnesota. There is an important subtext here that whether or not one believes with one jives with your overall stance on the recreational use of drugs, you have taken your expertise and proactively applied it in service of Black folks and in service of the administration of justice for Black folks. And I think that's extraordinarily important to pause and highlight, because these are people who are prosecuting a case that has tremendous ramifications across the board for the administration of justice, not only in this case, but for police authority in this country. So for you to have had this expertise, sought them out, attempted to break them off with a little bit of what you know, such that it can be applied to administer justice in this matter, is huge. And we should underscore that. And it shows not only can you do that in a multitude of other matters in this country based on your expertise, but it goes back to something that I consistently talk about on this show and in other forums, which is when you have an expertise, no matter what you know about, there is a place to apply your expertise in service of justice for Black people in this country. Whatever your universe of expertise is, your name gonna be called. It will be called, because in a country that's built exclusively by, for, and of white men for them to participate in, everything is unfair. Everything is fundamentally unfair. So I don't care what you know, there is a time for you to apply your expertise in service of justice. So I appreciate you doing that, Dr. Hart.
Well, I appreciate you saying it, Don, because, one of the things we were taught is that, well, they can't take away your education. This is what my grandmother would say. And so that she always instilled education. But the thing is, what they do is they try and go after your reputation. And that's the thing that really has upset me in recent weeks about this whole thing. I mean, the fact is, every day at Columbia, we give drugs like heroin, we give drugs like methamphetamine, we give drugs like crack cocaine without incident. And we do it with taxpayers' dollars. Nobody's saying anything about these sort of things. And we do that so we can have an understanding of what these drugs do and what they don't do.
Who are you giving them to?
We're giving them to research volunteers, people who have a history of drug use, the drugs that we're studying, and they have medical examinations beforehand. So they're carefully screened, these participants. But the point is that we have a huge scientific database on these drugs, and everyone in science knows it. But the problem is that there are few people in science who look like me, Black people, and who come from places like where I come from. And so when you see the lies and the carnage that has happened as a result of the lies about drugs, and you feel compelled. I feel compelled to speak out. But I could have just shut up and collected my money and continue to publish in the scientific literature, which I still do, but I could have just not said anything, and I'm good. But how can you do that in good faith when you know that what you are doing every day and what you see every day, now somebody is saying that, oh no, when these people do it, it's different. It's completely different. That's the thing I tried to highlight in the new book.
So Doc, can you talk about, aside from the recent wave, and historically it's recent against the backdrop of all of American history, aside from the recent wave of marijuana legalization, right? And Oregon being the outlier in legalizing everything, right? Can you talk about how the distinction between alcohol and tobacco, quote unquote legal, and other Schedule C, I guess, federal drugs being illegal. How did that come to be? You clearly know the history of cocaine and criminalization of recreational drugs. When did the distinction happen between alcohol and other drugs, given what we know about alcohol being every bit as deadly, far more abused, and either acutely deadly or over the long term deadly in terms of the derogation of the body?
Yeah, so
before you answer, I just want to just make not a distinction. Oregon did not legalize; they just decriminalized.
Correct.
So they didn't legalize all; they just decriminalized.
No, very important distinction. You're right, Karen.
That's right. So when we think about the history of this, the first thing that we need to understand is that tobacco was excluded from all drug laws. That was done in the early 1900s. So tobacco would never be considered a drug. The nicotine in tobacco is not considered a drug. So the FDA cannot regulate tobacco. It's excluded. It's an agricultural product.
Is it a drug though?
Of course it's a product. Of course it's a drug. Nicotine.
So because of the planters in Virginia and other places, that drug is not considered a drug. Because of the economy that tobacco brought to America, particularly in the early 1700s.
That's right. Because of the Southern power brokers who had tobacco farms, they lobbied Congress. Some of them were in Congress. They got tobacco to be excluded. So tobacco, it will never be considered a drug in the country because it's one of those exclusions. Now, with alcohol, we went after alcohol, particularly around World War I, because a lot of the Germans owned the bars and the breweries, and we didn't like the Germans. So the Germans were the targeted group. So we actually banned alcohol in 1919, and we banned alcohol from 1919 to 1933. We decided to overturn prohibition because people were drinking anyway. And we also had this promise of the taxes from alcohol. We said that, okay, if we overturn prohibition, there will be no more income tax. And so the American public went for that. Of course, we still have income tax. So alcohol was considered and seen as a drug just like everything else, like it is. And alcohol had a lobby. They had people who were making the product, making money from it, who wanted it to be legal. Whereas cocaine had been so closely associated with Black people in the press, the white sort of power brokers weren't really trying to advocate for this drug because it had this stain, this racial stain. And then we can think about things like the opioids. Opioids had a similar sort of stain with the Chinese merchants, the Chinese opium den owners. One of the things that the American white businessman tried to do was that we got laws to say that white people could not be patrons in the Chinese opium dens. And in that way, they would shut down the Chinese opium operators. Eventually, they did. And they associated the opium or the opioid drugs with the Chinese. And eventually, they outlawed many of those drugs. And then later, 20 years later, in the 1930s or so, did the same thing with marijuana, closely associated with Black people, with Mexican Americans. And it didn't have a lobby. And so those drugs didn't have a lobby. And so as a result,
it sounds to me, and I used to work for the biggest alcohol brand in the world for a long time. It sounds to me that you can draw this distinction with alcohol being conflated with, German ownership in the bars and pubs and whatnot, and Irish pubs, German, brewery owners. That sounds a whole lot like when various white ethnic groups became white, right? And became homogenized. Therefore, let us no longer demonize, let us no longer, illegalize what they're doing, right? Because they are now all of us.
Absolutely.
That is to be distinguished from them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the Germans eventually became white, Irish eventually became white. And so it's us making money again, whereas those other drugs, they still had the negative association with Black and Mexican Americans. And so you didn't have anybody to champion those causes. But to be clear, they are all chemicals that alter the functioning of the brain in some way and your mood and behavior. And so when people make these distinctions, those are artificial distinctions. The body doesn't make those kind of distinctions. This is sociology and not biology, basically. And so that's the important point. It's like when people make these distinctions and say, well, this drug is illegal versus this one, that's artificial. That's not a real thing. That's a human-made kind of thing. And it's a human-made thing in order to perpetuate, in order to facilitate our American racism.